On December 1, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. In our timeline, her courageous act sparked the peaceful Montgomery Bus Boycott and became a pivotal moment in the civil rights movement. But what if her arrest had triggered widespread racial violence instead? Today, we explore an alternate history where the dream of equality was delayed for decades. In this alternate timeline, Rosa Parks' arrest didn't lead to peaceful protest. Instead, it became a flashpoint for racial violence. White supremacist groups, emboldened by segregationist leaders, launched attacks on black communities, sparking deadly riots across the South. What began as a fight for justice turned into a battle for survival. Amid the chaos, leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. pushed for nonviolence, but the movement began to splinter. Younger activists, frustrated by the lack of progress, called for armed resistance. The unity that defined the civil rights movement in our history gave way to division, weakening its ability to fight for change. The federal government, paralyzed by political fears and Cold War priorities, failed to act. President Eisenhower avoided direct intervention, while Congress, dominated by segregationists, blocked every attempt to pass civil rights legislation. This inaction emboldened Southern states to double down on Jim Crow laws, ensuring that segregation remained the law of the land. By the 1960s, the South had become a war zone. Black neighborhoods organized militias for self-defense, while white supremacist groups ramped up their attacks. Cities like Birmingham saw nightly bombings, shootings, and violent clashes. The dream of peaceful resistance was shattered, replaced by a bitter and bloody conflict. America's racial crisis wasn't just a domestic issue, it became a global embarrassment. Images of racial violence tarnished America's image abroad, especially as it claimed to be the leader of the free world. Newly independent African nations, once potential allies, turned away, while the Soviet Union used the unrest as propaganda to discredit democracy itself. By the 1970s, segregation remained deeply entrenched. Schools, neighborhoods, and even public facilities were still divided by race. Separate rarely meant equal, as black communities faced underfunding, poverty, and systemic oppression. The dream of integration seemed farther away than ever, with no civil rights legislation in sight. As peaceful efforts failed, radical movements emerged on both sides. Black liberation groups, inspired by global revolutions, clashed with growing white nationalist organizations. Urban centers became battlegrounds for guerrilla-style conflicts, pushing the United States into a cycle of domestic terrorism and fear. The violence and segregation also tore apart the economy and culture. Racial divisions in the labor market stifled growth, while international companies pulled out of the volatile United States market. Even sports and entertainment remained segregated, depriving the nation of the cultural breakthroughs that had unified it in our timeline. By the late 1980s, the United States was more divided than ever. Calls for greater autonomy from black communities grew louder, while segregationist states flirted with secession. The country teetered on the edge of a second civil war, with no clear path toward reconciliation or unity. This alternate history shows how fragile progress can be, and how easily a different choice can lead to a much darker path. In our timeline, the civil rights movement achieved monumental victories through unity, courage, and nonviolence. Rosa Parks' act of defiance wasn't just a stand against segregation, it was a stand for a better future for all Americans. History reminds us that the fight for justice is never easy, but it is always worth it. If you found this exploration of alternate history thought-provoking, be sure to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments. What do you think America would look like today if Rosa Parks' act of defiance had led to a different outcome?